Hi, this is a talk that I gave at PodCamp Halifax in January of 2019, and I actually did manage to get a recording of it, but the audio didn't work very well in that recording. So I'm re-recording it at home just with the slideshow and the voiceover. And this was actually the 8th PodCamp presentation I've done. PodCamp is a great way to sort of try out new talks and introduce things. And I found that every year I try to make sure that I do something interesting enough in my year of work that is worth talking about at PodCamp. And 2018 was a real doozy for that. I got a really interesting project. This is what I want to share with you today. So, hi, I'm Andrew Burke. I'm a Halifax-based independent developer, teacher, trainer, sort of an artist, and occasional entrepreneur. I've been doing software professionally for over 20 years. And before I was a professional software nerd, I was also kind of a drama nerd. Yes, and here I am at 18 years old as Demetrius in my high school production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Catch the sports Walkman there. I've always been interested in theater, but to be honest, freelance software development doesn't tend to overlap with theater all that much. So I was excited when I was contacted by Halifax's Zupa Theatre a year or so ago to help them in their groundbreaking project, This Is Nowhere. Now, if anybody had come to my talk at PodCamp last year in 2018, I did a big talk, which I've got a recording of, which I'll share in the links here. I talked about what I was going to do with this project, and I shared some of my ideas and my plans. And this year, I'm going to talk about what I did do with this project. The show happened in late September of 2018, and it was one of the most amazing projects I've ever worked on in my life. But what actually was it? Well, it's probably easiest to use their own promotional copy. The Zupa Theatre, acclaimed for groundbreaking, contagiously playful theatre, invites you to become part of the largest street theatre project ever in Halifax. 1 part scavenger hunt and 1 part immersive theatre performance, This Is Nowhere will bring the city to life as each audience member becomes a hero in their own unique quest through the streets of Halifax. This free performance will run for 5 days only and include 1,000 audience members, 2 renowned choirs, dozens of undercover actors, multiple secret locations, and will promise to be one of the most talked about events of 2018. Well, and it's already 2019, and I'm still talking about it. Now, for some background on the general concept of the piece, the idea is they sort of made a story up about this group of utopian and thinkers in the late 1960s who wrote a manifesto. They called it a blueprint for a perfect future city. Now, this group of utopians and planners fell apart under their own internal divisions and divisiveness, and the original blueprint was lost. And as part of the show, the audience become participants in recovering the stories of the group, and then also in building a new blueprint based on the various themes in the original, each of which is represented by a performance of some kind. And here's a list of the themes that we ran with and their icons and everything. And so the show had a dozen themes, and each theme was tied to a different hidden performance location. And these locations were scattered all around downtown Halifax. Some, like the Central Library, were big enough for dozens of people to experience at a time, and some were so small that they only allowed 1 audience member in at a time. And there were also street performers wandering the streets, just doing interesting stuff that, symbolically tied back to the whole thing, so that people wandering around would see all this stuff happening, and they might not even know whether it's just street life or a performance. You experience the city in a different way, with the past and the future combining into the present. It was in many ways what you call reality augmented. So, for example, in the scene called Justice, local Afro-Nova Scotian activist Sabaz Benjamin set up a complicated and ambiguous interaction between people of color and a police officer who was also a person of color. And all of this would be viewed by participants looking down on it from the pedway above Albemarle Street behind the mall. Now you can see there. So nobody can hear what's actually being said. You're only seeing the actions and trying to come up with your own story of what's going on. One of the other scenes, for example, the scene called Disagreement, was only for 1 person at a time. You were led to a table at the Stubborn Goat Brew Pub, and this guy argued with you. While restaurant life happened all around you, with people sitting at the bar, people having dinner, etc., all oblivious that there was an actual theater production happening right in front of them. The locations were all hidden. There's no sign saying, "This is nowhere, come here," or anything. It's all hidden. It's also a secret guerrilla theater happening, in the middle of everything else going on downtown. And people were guided to the locations, the secret hidden locations, using a GPS-enabled mobile app. And the app provided clues and wayfinding to help you get to the locations. And then when you were actually there, it had captions and prompts helping enhance the performances that you were watching. Which location you got sent to was decided by a server-side algorithm that did some load balancing and things to make sure the single person locations only got one person at a time. And what was cool is that everybody experienced a different set of locations, and nobody got to see every performance. So two people could go through the entire show and see a completely different set of scenes, or some of the same scenes but in different order. And this made it a very unique. People gathering together after the show would talk about what they saw, and they would realize that they'd seen completely different versions of the experience. And I built all the software for this show. So I built the mobile app for both iOS and Android. I built the content management system, which supported the mobile app. I built the system that figures out where each participant was going to be sent to and when. I built the audience handling interface used by site managers. I built the ticketing system, and I had the time of my life. So what was it like? Well, here's what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about the development roller coaster, which was quite epic because there was a lot of stuff going on in here that I and nobody else had really ever done before. It's not like you can go out and get a book and you have 21 days to mobile-enabled theater apps for dummies, right? So this was a lot of development challenges. We had a bunch of really key UI decisions we needed to make, and I want to talk about some of those. One of the big factors in this production was we wanted to make sure that it was accessible, and I'd done a little bit of accessibility work, but this is by far the biggest accessibility-related project that I worked on, and I wanted to share some insights I had with that. I want to sort of share the story of what it was like going live, the whole experience of launching software as a theater production all at the same time. And also I want to sort of do a side note on what it's like working with theater people, because I think there's some misunderstandings around it, about that. And then finally talk a little bit about what's next. But first, the apps. So we needed some kind of software. This was all new. Like I said, there's no Environmental Theater for Dummies book that you can just get with a bunch of pre-made libraries that you can just plug together. This was all new, and this is all new not just for the software side of things, but for the writers and performers as well. This was going to be kind of a unique kind of experience. And when we started, we just had some ideas. We didn't know which locations we were going to be at. We had a basic idea of the theme. We had no script. This was all going to be in development, construct creatively at the same time as we were writing the software. But we really needed something for the creative team to work with so they would understand sort of some of these ideas of the possibilities of the software, what it could do, what it was about. So, we wanted to make sure that they could have something to work with. And I needed to be able to get something out there that people could start using so I could see what worked and what didn't. I'm a big fan of getting something, or at least anything, in the hands of users as early as possible in any software project I have, because that's really the only way that people can understand the possibilities and of what works and what doesn't. So right up front, and this is something I've done a lot, for a very fast, easy start, we built a simple version just as a single mobile-friendly web page in straight-up HTML with some JavaScript and some jQuery to make some of the stuff a little easier. There you can see this is actually most of the web page right here. Most of the content is actually the login screen, which goes away, but most of the real action happens in those three items at the top: the title, the wayfinding, and then the main content area. And all of that is handled, all of that is filled in with content using a bunch of JavaScript and jQuery. What was great with this is a great way to start. There was no complicated download process. There's no app store review or anything like that. There's nothing to install. Just go to a web page, and there you go. And what's great also is, as we're making changes, and of course this early in the process, we're making lots of changes all the time, it's easy to go live, simply redeploy what you've got and ask people to reload their browser, and bang, we've got the changes. And it's also, what's really key with this is really simple tools, which I've worked with for years. I've been doing HTML since the mid-90s, JavaScript and jQuery also almost that long. And that meant that I didn't have to wrestle with new concepts in coding. I could just focus on the UX, the user experience, and making it understandable, and working with feedback from the users and the writers to try to get a sense of how to fit things together. So I could focus on what needs to be done rather than wrestling with frameworks and code. So we started doing trial runs with the core team and writers, and it was actually a huge amount of fun. And it was super insightful too. Out of the team, they basically every so often they pick one of them, and then everyone else would create experiences for them and write captions and prompts for the system, and we'd get the software set up for them, and then they'd sort of go on their own personal tour of Halifax, getting all the actors and everybody else building these environments for them. It was really kind of an exciting, fun experience. And that gave everyone a chance to get a sense of the creative and dramatic possibilities, and I got lots of usability and tracking information. This also let me start to fine-tune the server side of things. Pretty early on, it was obvious that this would have to be a client-server app for the content management so that the writers could work directly in the software so they wouldn't have to just send stuff over to me to manually enter every time, but also to manage the performance and participants. As I said, we needed to sort of load balance different people at different places. It's also really important that we need to be able to track where people are, how far away from where they're going to be, where they're going, where they're going to be coming from, things like that. And especially for the early parts of the testing, so we could keep track of how people are progressing and whether people are getting lost after certain clues and stuff like that. And just like how HTML and JavaScript was great for building the client side quickly and easily, I did the server side in Ruby on Rails with some jQuery and Bootstrap on top and hosted it on Heroku. And these are all technologies I've been using for years and years and years professionally, some of which like over a decade now. And this was a key thing, especially this early phase in the process. If you're venturing into the unknown, use familiar tools. At least at the start, using simple, well-known technologies was super important. We were doing a new kind of software and a new kind of theater that was new for everybody involved and possibly new for anybody ever, right? There was so much unknown going on here that we really wanted to make sure that we didn't have to wrestle with completely different frameworks and platforms. Using familiar tools meant that I only had to worry about the much bigger picture of usability and how it was going to work as a storytelling medium. Now, the client and server were coming together nicely. Here's a late version of the early web-based prototype, actually in progress, sort of a little video we took of it. And they were coming together nicely. We had some stuff working, we were able to track things, etc. But there was a big problem. And I've been worried that GPS would be a bit of a headache with JavaScript. I mean, it was one of those unknown things, but it turns out JavaScript libraries for GPS these days are actually pretty robust and pretty good. So it wasn't actually GPS, but it was GPS related. It was the GPS permissions that caused all the trouble. These are the real problems. GPS permissions were a giant headache. So, when you open up an app and it says, this app would like to access your photo library, or this app would like to access your microphone, or this app would like to access your location services, your locations, which is GPS. We needed that for the browser, for the app to work pretty well. Like, we could support it without it, but it made it a lot worse. The whole idea is you are a scavenger hunt finding locations downtown. So having GPS was really a key thing to trigger events and figure out where people are. And the browser can ask for access to these things. However, a lot of people have that turned off by default. A lot of browsers don't work that way. And for example, on iOS, and a lot of people also just, if something prompt pops on a browser, they'll just hit no, right? Which is a perfectly legitimate way to handle all the stupid prompts people ask you, like websites asking to send you notifications every time there's a new news article or something. And so we had a lot of people were having trouble. Even worse, there's a lot of people, for example, if we sent them a link in email to, here's the address to hit, if they open that in the Gmail app on their phone, Gmail has its own embedded browser inside the Gmail app, which doesn't have permission to access all of these things. So that got even worse. And so a quarter of our users ended up having permissions problems during our early testing. And this is a pretty savvy, pretty smart kind of crowd that was pretty up on top of things. If a quarter of our testers had problems, if this was going to be a giant nightmare during the show where we had hundreds and hundreds of people out in real time trying to do things, we could be dealing with dozens and dozens of people with GPS failing on them. And so pretty early we realized this is just not going to work out very well for us. As just the web app was good for testing and good for 80% of the people, but not covering all the rest of the people was going to be a big mess. So we decided we were really going to need to switch to dedicated apps at this point. Now, I'd already done some work on an iOS version of this. I've been doing iOS development for quite a while, but we were going to need Android as well. And I knew this was going to be an issue at some point, and I figured, well, I could probably learn Android, or we could get somebody to do it. But we were starting to get concerned that we're going to have multiple code bases. It would have been great if we could have just had the web thing work, and then we would only have to worry about the one thing. But it looks like we're going to have native apps. But if it's only just me as the only developer person, having multiple code bases is going to start to get really, really ugly really fast, especially because I could tell this was going to be the kind of project where we're going to have changes going down to the wire, right down to the end of things, which would multiple code bases makes that kind of thing much, much harder to deal with. But I did find a solution, and it was a really great solution. The final project was done in React Native. Now, React is a JavaScript library used by Facebook, invented by Facebook, and they use it to manage their fairly complex user interfaces on their web pages. You got all these, your news feed, you've got your messenger boxes, you've got posting, you've got picture libraries, all the different stuff that happens in Facebook. All of that's done with React as a front-end JavaScript library. Well, React Native is a spin-off of that instead of outputting just to HTML and JavaScript in a browser, it outputs to native code components in iOS and Android. And so you can write it once and it renders down to high performance, fast native code running on native apps in iOS and Android, which is awesome. And so this is what Facebook uses for their stuff. And React has become super popular. And React Native is also becoming super popular as well. And I'd been meaning to try it for a while. And I did an early draft version as an experiment, and it worked really, really, really well. So I decided to just go with it and ran with it as our main core thing for this project. And I'm really glad I did because it turned out to be a super great solution for that. Our UI wasn't super complicated. We didn't have dozens and dozens of complex widgets, and it was fairly neutral anyway. It didn't have special platform-specific stuff going on. So that was made it nice to be able to work with Android and iOS. And as a bonus, and this saved us a huge amount of time and energy, since I'd already done a lot of the original stuff in JavaScript, all this code for accessing the server data with JSON and processing it, a lot of the GPS management and location management code, backend stuff that didn't mess with the user interface, that was already been done, and that had already been done in JavaScript. So I was able to reuse a lot of this JavaScript and copy and paste it right back into the React Native project, and it all worked right out of the box. This was fantastic. Now, React Native under the hood is 3 different kinds of terrible mess, giant nightmare mess of duct tape and twine. It's always amazing that it works at all. And here's 3 sets of error messages and warning messages from iOS. You got all the weird flakiness of iOS with weird libraries that have lots of warnings. You have all the weird error messages and flakiness of Android development with all the weird stuff with their libraries. And finally, you have all the weird messes and chaos of the Node JavaScript world. And you can see here we have 956 packages just to basically say hello world in React Native. So it's crazy under the hood, and it's a miracle that it does in fact work at all. But when you're working at the top level building components, it's got this really nice component model architecture, which is pretty good to work with. It's got a layout engine that's kind of sort of based on CSS and Flexbox. So it's really actually very powerful and flexible and really nice to work with for much of the time once you get the hang of it. And even better, we only needed 1 code base. It was such a relief. And now that I know React Native, I could be cool again because I hadn't been very cool with coding since I was doing Ruby on Rails back in like 2006 when Ruby on Rails was the hottest thing in the world. So I've been a bit behind the times now. So finally I get back to being cool again. And I've never really got the facial hair that would really give me a nice majestic hipster beard. So at least I can do React Native. So for what that's worth. Next, I want to talk about UI and UX considerations. As this developed, we were working a lot on UI ideas, and part of this is that people were going to be just using this out of the blue in the context of a live theater production, and we wanted to make sure that they would be able to pick it up and understand it almost instantly. We didn't want to have like a training session or workshops or anything. We wanted to be able to make this, just pick it up and use it. And we had a few key components that we really needed to work on, and I'm really kind of happy with how some of these came out. The core idea of this is you have this interface where clues are showing up to help guide you to where you're supposed to go. And these are fairly short clues that show up on your screen. And our first attempt at this was just every 5 seconds or 10 seconds or so, a new clue shows up full screen on the phone. And that was okay just as a tech demo, but very quickly we realized that was going to be a complete no-go for actually people using it, because people are out there in the world, they're trying to cross traffic, they're trying to engage with this theater thing going on, and if something's popping up every 5 seconds on the phone out of your control completely, you can't really engage with that, and you're going to miss content, you're going to get hit by a car or something. All these things are just, we wanted to have our own triggers so that things would show up on some sense of our schedule, but we also wanted to make sure the users could have some control over the tempo as well. And after a lot of trial and error, we settled on this. So items would show up, but they would show up with a tappable cover. And we could add a label, and we could also specify the image or icon that showed up as well. So these could be customized. They have a default look, but they also could be adjusted as you needed to. So this is, for example, the first one actually says tap me, so just people know really what's going on. And until you tap the cover, nothing else is triggered. So the app is basically frozen until you tap the cover. When you tap the cover, content shows, then you can read the caption. And then that triggers the search for the timing for the next item. So the next item's in the hopper, it's ready to roll. Usually it waits about 5 seconds or so, a few seconds to show up. But we can also do things like this item won't show up until you've gotten to a certain distance closer to the destination, or we can add extra longer time limits or shorter time limits. We can force it to be 1 second or force it to be 90 seconds, depending on what we wanted to do. But what was nice is that count doesn't start until after the person taps. So that way they have control, making sure they only tap when they're ready, and the app can still have some control over the tempo at the same time. Also, new items show up at the top, but only after you've tapped the previous one. You can see it tapping on the caption. It slides down. Here we go. We can read it, and we can tap again, and there's reader caption, and then it slides down again. And also, it's sort of sliding down from the top as new items are covered. You can scroll down that list and see all the previous clues. So especially if you're a scavenger hunt, you might want to go back and look at your old clues, make sure you didn't miss something if you're trying to guess what was going on. And this is nice. The new content showing up at the top, pushing everything down, scrollable interface on a mobile device, kind of looks a lot like Twitter or your Facebook timeline. So this is usually an interface that most people would already be kind of familiar with. So that was kind of nice. And this is actually the first few clues for going to the location called Love, which is an apartment downtown somewhere. And you can see here we have an item at the top there where the next clue will appear in 60 seconds. So this allows us to make sure that they have some time to wander around without having to constantly be checking their phone as well. When you get to the destination, instead of blue, things turn to orange, and you get switched to a set of captions which enhance the location experience. For example, here you can see, at the security door for the building, enter 0 and 304. This is a kind of way we can sneak people into these locations without having to put signs up everywhere and distract and get random passers-by from the public joining the thing. We can have our own little secret world only unlocked by the app. Anyways, these captions will enhance the location experience, which is kind of nice. Give you things to think about, give you prompts to help you get to where you go, as well as specifics for what you're going to do in the location. Now, for example, these were showing you how to get to the Love episode. And in this, you'd go to the virtual apartments just off Spring Gardens, where someone would meet you, with the red scarf. So you've been told the person with the scarf would guide you where you go. And they go up to one of the guest suites, which is turned into a set for basically somebody's apartment, where someone is going through a breakup and they're having a bit of a breakdown because of this breakup, and they're narrating their own sort of story about this. And it got really intense because you're walking with sort of basically this person's home, and it's not a set that looks like a home. It actually is an apartment. And so you're standing there there's this bunch of random strangers in this apartment watching this person going through this very personal and emotional time. It was quite a powerful, interesting way, and you wouldn't be able to really do this without doing this kind of app-based thing with lots of clues helping people out. Now, after the performance, the participants were asked to write their thoughts in about that topic, so the topic of love or commerce or authority or whatever. And they'd write their thoughts about that topic into the app, and that would help to contribute to this new version of our utopian blueprint. And this was sent back to the server, and we used that content later on, and we'll show you what that did later on in the talk here. Now, finally, when you finished at a location, you'd end up going into this nice little waiting area. And this let people take a break. So instead of like the original versions, you just might immediately started your next search for the next area, for the next location, which meant that nobody could really stop for a bit. But this let people take a break. They could get themselves a beverage of choice, or just, wander around a bit, go to the bathroom, etc. And this also helped keep our tracking clean, because we were able to ensure things like GPS were reset properly. The tracking closed on the one and didn't start yet for the next one until you hit the button. It's always important to be able to, it's easier to trigger things on a button hit than when certain other key events happen. It's sort of nice. And this way we could give our users a rest, as well as give our system a little bit of a rest as well. I learned a lot in this project about pacing and tempo, and a lot about the give and take between live software and users in real time. A lot of the software I work with is mostly business software, where it sort of just waits for people to do something and then they fill out a form and submit it. This was a much more interesting interactive, and had to worry about this flow and back and forth. So, let users take breaks in their interactive experience is good for them. And it turns out it's actually good for your software, because software is like sort of somebody can sort of check out of it for a while you clean stuff up behind the scenes. GPS and things like that, we often found needed a bit of a reset time to make sure that it was all running properly and stuff. Also, this was a late addition, this whole sort of waiting area in between, but I really liked how it sort of came out. I put this cloud background, which had been used in some of the promotional materials on the website. And I like this sort of history underneath. It showed where you'd been. So this person had gone through Play, Justice, Love, Commerce, Authority. And so they could actually see, oh, this is the ones I went to. I remember that performance, etc. So it gives them a nice subset. Also, I just like this, the tone. You have experienced love. You have experienced justice. And I kind of like that kind of tone to it because it kind of reminded me of sort of in video games or in the Scott Pilgrim movie. Scott has earned the power of self-respect. Or once again, unlocking achievements in video games. So, trophy earned, achievement unlocked. And this turns out not to be the only video game reference that we talked about. Wayfinding was also a really big deal for us. It's one of the biggest usability challenges in this is how do we get people to know where to go in an easy and consistent and but not too precise way because we want to still make it challenging. And this is actually one of the things that video games have spent a lot of time wrestling with. How to get people to get to the locations without just being too obvious. Our early prototypes, just to making sure the technology worked, actually just had an arrow pointing to where the destination was and showed you the distance. So in this case, you can see in the very bottom there, it's kind of small, but it says 517.86 meters, right? But that's not exactly a challenge, right? But that's also a big headache because GPS is a lot flakier than you might think if you're just using it occasionally on a map program. I've learned a lot of how these map programs cheat to make it look like it's much more precise than it is. But GPS will easily bounce around a dozen meters here and there, or possibly a lot more, depending on how fresh it is and how good the tracking is. And so if it says 517.86 meters, you might be standing still and you think, wow, down to the centimeter and go exactly how far I need to go. And then suddenly it'll change to be 480 meters or 540 meters or whatever. So it could change immediately without even you having to move. And we found having too much precision gave people too much of a sense that, oh, they know where we are to the centimeter, when in fact that's not the case. We had the same problem with fine-tuned progress bars, which were just like pixel to pixel progress all the way down. Once again, gave this people this weird false sense of accuracy, and you might be going the right direction, and because of the way GPS hiccups, it might look like you're going the opposite direction. It ended up confusing people more than helping them. Too much precision can actually be confusing if it's not actually correct. Well, at the time, I'd been playing a fair bit of Mass Effect Andromeda, which is a sort of pretty good but kind of uneven game. But one of the things I liked about it is some of the missions you have to go on are sort of, you're hunting for secret hidden items here and there. Sound familiar? Right. But they had, when you get close enough to that, this starts this separate interface for finding things, which has this, as you can see from the top, sort of a cold, warmer, hot, sort of 3-level interface. And when you get really close, it starts flashing and things to let you know when you're there. Then you can start looking around the environment to see if you can find the, the secret document or the hidden minerals or whatever the kinds of things you're looking for. And this idea of having just slices that are kind of arbitrary distance inside of them seemed to really work out nicely for us. So slices, we ended up breaking it down. We first tried with 5 and then ended up with 10. Seemed to be a pretty good set. Slices cover the vagaries of GPS because it's not bouncing around by a meter at a time. They're big enough to sort of cover most of the time those weird hiccups where it moves around a little bit. You're still within the same slice. Well, you still get a good sense of progress because you sort of see them one after the other and you start building the thing. You get closer and closer and you can see this, slice of things is getting closer and closer as well. So this is one of these things that's really great. It turned out to be a great insight to help people guide things. But what kinds of slices should we have? Now, I started the early ideas of this interface, as you saw some of it earlier, was based on the idea that it was based on this sort of old manifesto, typewritten manifesto from the 60s. And I sort of assumed that they were maybe just typing it out on an old manual typewriter and maybe running it through one of those mimeograph machines, which gives you that purple alcohol-based copy thing. And I thought of the idea of having stars and dashes, which is sort of an old typewriter way of dividing sections on a page before you couldn't have graphical rules. And what was nice, that dashes and stars, asterisks look different enough that you can really get a sense of progress as the stars fill in. And I thought that was a good placeholder just until we figured something else out. But after working with the prototype for this, the stars became really iconic for a lot of what was going on in the show, and the writers actually started using the idea of stars in their writing. So follow the stars, they will lead you to your destiny, or stars can be fickle, stars aren't necessarily always going to be the right thing. So the answer lies in the stars. And that actually seemed it was really cool. So we kept it as it was. And we actually tried at a certain point swapping to, maybe something like an actual star image, but it made it look like a rating system, like for Yelp or Uber or your app store, and it felt like, oh, as you're getting closer, you're getting more stars, which seemed kind of wrong. So we kept with the dashes and the asterisks, and it actually worked really, really well. And you can see as you get closer and closer, it fills in with more and more detail. And eventually when you get to the destination, it pops up and shows orange. One of the other nice things is we could cheat a little bit with these. So you get your first star slightly earlier than you would normally do. I've been reading a whole bunch about how video games spend a lot of time cheating to make the experience better for the user. And then you never get to the final star, even if it's a chunk of the tenth of the way that you get there, until you're actually at the destination within the specified official destination radius. And so it was nice. It gives you this sort of back and forth and gives you a really nice, easy to understand interface for seeing what's going on. And the idea of just stars being raw text tied into a general theme for the app in general in our development. The app wasn't flashy. It wasn't flashy at all. It was simply blocks of color, text, and large simple icons occasionally, and sometimes a cloud background. The app is not the main attraction. It's a supplement to the real show, and it's basically a wrapper for the content that's being shown to you. The real work was in how we decide when to show the clues, how that works, how we do a lot of tracking on the back end. But the app itself, we did not have 3D zooming animation and rotating things and bouncing and all sorts of stuff like that. We just tried to keep it as simple and clean as possible because it should not distract from the real core of the thing, which is this production, this theater production, this experience that's happening all around. And it took a lot of work to keep it feeling this simple and clean and minimal and understandable. The fewer things you have, the really key thing was like most of the time there's only one thing you can do at a time. There's one button and you press it. That's it. There's no complicated two-finger swipe things or whatever. There's one button. There is a bottom bar which gives you some help information, but that's it. Mainly you're just tapping the one thing. That's it, and that's really important. As one of our actors said after one of our demos, after we'd really polished up the software, quoting Dolly Parton, "It sure costs a lot to look this cheap," which frankly I find are words to live by in UI and UX development. As I said earlier, one of the things that was a key part of this project was accessibility. Part of the funding for this project actually depended on making it an accessible experience that everybody could experience, even if they had limitations with mobility or hearing or sight. And we did several key things for accessibility. The big one is we met with community members, the accessibility activist community, to get a sense of what needed to be done, like what was important for them, what would work, what wouldn't work. That was a key. Of course, with everything else, get feedback from people about what it feels like for them. We also tried to keep, with the standards, and React Native supports a lot of the built-in stuff in iOS and Android for things like modular font sizes and inverting the display and things like that to make it easier for people to work with. And even sort of works with screen reader kind of technology. And then when we did the registration, we asked people what they need on the registration form. It's an optional second page to the registration form. But also the one key thing we did is we put this on a scale. So it's not, I don't have any mobility issues, or I am in a wheelchair. There's a whole bunch of, I just get sore or tired and would rather not walk too much is one of the options. Or it's not, I can hear perfectly and I'm deaf. It's also, I have some hearing issues occasionally and I'd like to get a bit more support for my hearing, or I'd like to see a little better. Maybe my eyesight isn't as great as it used to be. And also space for other details. And that was a big insight, was treat accessibility as a gradient, right? There's not just I am perfectly athletic and everything is great. I have 20/20 vision and can hear, a pin drop, all the way to, I am stuck in a wheelchair and I need sign language interpreters and things like that. There's a whole middle ground of people who could just use a little bit of help, or maybe a bit more help. It's not a yes/no thing. And in fact, once the registration started coming, I was a little bit surprised, to be honest, at how many registrants mentioned some problems. But I guess I shouldn't have been that surprised, because everyone's got some problems here and there in certain ways. Not everybody, a larger number of people out there are dealing with little issues all the time. And it's good to be able to support them as well as people with bigger ones. Now, in the back end, we tagged some of our locations as not accessible. Just with the way that the project was trying to find locations that were all within a particular radius downtown that were available and things. Some of them were just going to have only really accessible through steep staircases or other things like that. But what we were able to do is simply not include those particular items in the algorithm that decides where you're going to be going next. And as you can see from this little snippet of Ruby code from the server side, we also made it pick closer locations. If you did have mobility issues, you can see there usually it picks randomly from the 5 closest available locations. But if you have mobility issues, it picks from the 3, so that you're not going to have to go as far as you would otherwise. You get things that are a bit closer, you have a tighter experience. But what's good about the show is that, like, leaving some of these locations out didn't wreck it. It wasn't like we're putting people in an unfortunate, sad box of limited experience. Remember, everybody's experience in this show is unique, and nobody ever got to see every single thing, every single venue. So limited mobility experience is just one different experience among many. And in fact, any other participant for the show might have ended up getting exactly the same locations as a limited mobility person, just through the luck of the way that the randomizing works in the algorithm. And also, not only locations were taggable, but clues and captions were taggable, which would have filters. The apps would filter the captions and things based on how the user had specified their accessibility, mobility, hearing, sight issues as well. And so you can see here on one of our things, we can tag, they get this particular tag, the second tag there, only if they don't have poor hearing, if their hearing's okay, because there's a bunch of dialogue and things like that. And if they do have poor hearing, we have a somewhat different caption. And it asks them for doing different things. And what's also nice is if you specified you can't hear so well, you have the option of having the entire script show up in the app for you, basically as subtitles for the experience when you were there. Also, what's nice, if you'd flagged that you had some issues, the site manager interface would show that, so the site manager could see people coming in who might have particular issues, so they could be aware that they need to be maybe met at the door and guided around where there's a separate entrance or something like that, depending on what was needed. It was kind of handy. People didn't show up, by surprise. We forgot that it's actually all in real time. They can come and get ahead of that as needed. We also had special settings in the app to use a bigger and bolder font if you wanted to. There's an option to hit a button. And that was, if you specified when you signed up that you had visibility issues, it would give you this bigger font. And now, of course, the operating systems also support bigger fonts, which we also included. But this was a nice way to do it without even having to go to settings. Now, this originally was only if you'd specified when you signed up, but I put a button in the app for testing just to make sure it worked. And I found when I'm out there in the middle of the day with really bright sunlight, I found I was using it myself just to be able to see the screen better. And so found out it's useful for everybody. So I added it as an option directly in the app for everyone. And they ended up doing the same thing with the captions for if you can't hear so well, where you get the whole script. I find because I'm not getting any younger myself, and my hearing starts to go, especially if I get a cold or something. So it goes to my ears immediately for some reason. So I end up needing to, it was great to be able to have that option. I often watch TV with subtitles on just because I'll miss bits of key dialogue here and there, especially if they're being quiet. So it was nice to be able to allow those options for anybody if they wanted to, not just if they specified up front that they had particular issues. And this is a key thing, and I've learned this over the years in my work in software in general. Accessibility features make things easier for everybody. Nobody is fully able, quote unquote, able all the time, right? Even if they normally have great vision and can hear well and don't have any particular mobility issues, maybe they've got a sports injury. Maybe they've got a baby they're pushing around in a cart. If you're pushing around a baby in a cart, suddenly they basically have many similarities and limitations to somebody who might be in a wheelchair. They've got wheels, they can't handle stairs. Maybe they've got a cold. Maybe they've had too many drinks and they're not thinking straight. Any number of things could cause them to need to use the accessibility features. So if the accessibility features are there, available to anybody, they make it better for anybody. And so this is one of the big key insights. Speaking of accessibilities, I think this is a good spot to describe the inclusion scene that we had. And this was one of the more mind-blowing ones. The app would lead you to the new design building, which is on Morris Street as part of the Dalhousie sort of extended campus. And you're led upstairs to this area with this sort of stepped seating area, which is kind of seating and auditorium space and also a bit of a staircase. And you go to there and you'd be sitting down and you sit down in there and look towards the front space of the room. And that front space, facing the steps, was local writer Jennifer Powley in her wheelchair. And the captions of her performance was basically the captions that come up in the app when you're there for the thing. So you can see here, I've got the app showing up in the little video. Hello, please look at me when I'm speaking to you. Again, that was sort of a joke. Up again, only sort of. So the lines of the presentation of the experience were happening in the app, but it was her performance in a way. And the audience had to then engage. We're forced to sort of, you can't just look past this person. This is the person performing here. But they were prompted to engage with her, wave hello, really take her presence into account, all in a room which was specifically built to not support people in wheelchairs, of course. And they were all doing this entire theatrical experience through the interface of this app that I had built. And I love this idea of using technology to create art, which opens your mind about things like identity and accessibility and ableism and architecture and the built city. I like all these things coming together. And this is the kind of project that this theater project experience that this all was. Now, by early September, we were ready to start getting the audience signed up. We had deployed the app to various app stores. And since tickets were free, I was able to build the registration system right into the rest of the server-side software. We didn't have to worry about integration headaches with some third-party service. If we were going to have to handle money and credit card payments, it might be a bit more of a headache. But since it was just a matter of signing up, we didn't have to worry about doing some other system that might not have the things we wanted. So we were able to build our own ticketing system with our own registration, which, as we showed in the accessibility section, we could actually add the special questionnaire and everything for that. And then it fed directly into the registration system, directly fed into the app system. So people would be given a passcode when they signed up, and that passcode would then be what they would use to access the app when they wanted to sign in. And then we could link the app to that particular user account. Anyway, launching the ticket system on our real app was also a nice early performance stress test, and it turned out to be fine. And we sent out announcements and links and watched the signups roll in. And soon we had waiting lists for every performance. Now this was real, right? This is real now. There is no going back. This is all going to have to work now. And how did it go? Well, it went pretty well. Now, the Downtown Halifax Business Commission, who are actually the official app sponsors, let us use their storefront space as a technical support, recharge your devices, maybe have a seat and get some water break station. So I set myself up in there with one computer and 2 iPads, and we got somebody else there to help out with people sometimes having more questions. And there I was also not only there to help people, but also I could track what everybody was doing during the show and keep fielding stuff through the phones from the site managers and somebody else. And yes, that's right, we tracked everybody during the show. Every device, turns out, is checking in with the server at least every 30 seconds with GPS coordinates, and sometimes much more often putting in, anytime somebody hits a clue or somebody hits a caption or writes in their feedback for their own blueprint, all of that's sent back to the app. And so we're tracking everything in real time. So we had a bunch of map interfaces where you could see all the dots moving around as people's devices checked in. And yes, this is a panopticon. This is total surveillance. In fact, we called this piece of the app the panopticon. And one of the clues even actually mentioned that in the authority section. Even this experience is a form of surveillance. And it's okay if that bothers you a bit. Now, I've been super aware of privacy issues. And in fact, when we were working this in sort of the latter half of 2018, a lot of big privacy scandals were coming out about Facebook and people like that. So I spent a lot of time working on fine-tuning the nuances of how privacy worked. The tracking, I made sure that the tracking for the app only kicked in during the time of the show where you had your ticket for. So it was 5:30 to 9 p.m. on Thursday. That's the only time the tracking actually checked in. And also, it only did the tracking when you're within about 1.5 kilometers of the destination you're supposed to go to. So if you give up early and go home, or maybe come late and we're somewhere else, we're not showing that. We're not holding that information. We're not keeping that information. We're not even collecting that information. So your privacy is protected, and we, of course, don't have to worry about all sorts of weird liability issues about stuff. I also spent a lot of time handcrafting the privacy statement, explaining exactly what we do and where and what data we're collecting, what we're tracking and everything. And for what it's worth, nobody ever asked about this, and nobody seemed to care at all. I'm glad I did it, but it's weird how we seem to totally be in the post-privacy era at this point. Anyway, I had custom interfaces for tracking the traffic loads at each location. You can see here the list of the locations and the audience size limits and where people are at different points currently. I could also override that and send specific people to specific spots. A lot of people wrote in saying, oh, my best friend is in the show. I want to make sure I get to see their show, their particular piece. Because like I said, you wouldn't automatically get that necessarily. People could send me technical support questions directly from the app. Maybe just everything from something's not working right to I can't find this destination. And I could reply via the email or text numbers that they included when signing up. And I had a lot of fun writing with a particular slightly ominous tone when writing about it. It felt very Matrix too. It was like, take the second door, no, that other door, turn back and go another block to the east, and then you'll find the thing. And then after every show, I was able to fine tune this, production experience to make things a bit easier for me and for the site managers. And by the time it was over, we had a really nice, smoothly running system. Now the creative team, regularly asked me if I was worried about server capacity when we went live. And I wasn't, because it was all on Heroku. Now Heroku is a cloud-based hosting platform, basically as a service. And you can dial up and down the server capacity in a matter of seconds, basically by using one command line or picking from a menu and maybe using a slider if you want to go nuts with fancier stuff. And what's nice is you can add capacity as needed, and they bill you by the minute, which is perfect for something like a show. So usually we were down in the $25 a month category, down for 1X dynos, just for the general testing and day-to-day usage and fine-tuning the content. But when the show kicked in, I dialed it up 3 top-tier Performance L dedicated hardware, multi-core, 14 gigabytes of RAM machines for those 4 hours of the show. You see there, it's $500 a month there. That comes to a total of $6 per performance, or $30 for the entire show, which is less than a round of drinks at the after party, but gave us monster hosting performance that we didn't have to worry about. And then, of course, when we're done, we just dial it back to 1X and we're back to where we were again. So this is a great, scalable hosting infrastructure is really, really great for productions and live events, because you can dial it way up only when you need it, and it's super cheap. And a big part of making sure things worked was having various ways we could still make the app work even if certain things like GPS or data connections failed. And this is one of the things, as I said, the folks kept worrying about the servers. They were really good at worrying about everything. In fact, I guess the kind of psyche that tries to organize a giant epic project like this, you're going to have to spend a lot of time being really good at worrying about what might go wrong. And one of the things we tried to make sure in this software, because so many different people with so many different devices all out there in the field doing stuff without us standing right next to them all the time, we're going to have stuff go wrong. So we want to really make sure things could cascade backwards without worrying too much. And the idea is, and I like this in software in general, the idea was to fail like an airplane. So if your engines fail in an airplane, you can glide, right, and probably still land the thing. Look at the that one that landed in the Hudson in New York a few years ago. Rather than a helicopter, where if the engine fails in a helicopter, it's basically a brick, and it just sort of lands, right? There's not much you can do if the engine fails in a helicopter. So I like to have software that maybe if the main part fails, it sort of gracefully fails and falls back to maybe a lower impact version of the software. So if the GPS doesn't work, you can still do the experience. It's just not quite as rich as experience, because it's not actually giving you extra context on things, but at least you can still experience the thing. And in fact, as a final last-ditch emergency backup, if everything totally failed and like the internet collapsed, we actually printed up a whole bunch of paper versions of the clues and captions, which we put into Ziploc bags just in case. We only ended up using a few of those for people whose phones totally had died or something like that, but it was great to have it. In fact, it's like bringing an umbrella, making sure that make sure that it doesn't rain. The fact we had we jokingly called the home game edition of the This Is Nowhere experience meant that we didn't actually have that many problems. But it was really nice to know that we had this as a backup. Still got a bag full of these in the basement if anyone wants to play with it sometime. Anyway, the most final amazing part of the show was the finale. At a specified time, the app would interrupt whatever else it was doing and start giving clues with a somewhat different color scheme to the final location, which is the architecture school down on Spring Garden next to the new library. And everyone would sort of gather by ones and twos. And coming in, you would meet people there, greeters with balloons, and you'd be led into this space. It's a bit loud here. These choirs singing, and this amazing purple light show. And there was this big central room full of people. All the actors and everybody else was also coming back from all the different locations, and all the other people who'd done the show. And you could get some refreshments, some snacks, and some cider and things. And there was also full of these projection screens, which had the original versions of the blueprint from the 60s, as well as this countdown. And really quite the visual space. You see these amazing blocks with all sorts of things going on in them. And then at a certain point, when we got closer, another choir would sing, and then there would be dancers, and suddenly the new blueprint appeared. I'd built an interface showing all the writing that the audience had been submitting all the way throughout the show. Remember, you could like fill in your thoughts about each topic. That all went back to our server. That was showing up in an interface that the lighting designers and people who did these fancy video and lighting effects were able to select from that, copy paste that into their software, and then that could become part of the light show. So this quote here on the wall is actually possibly might have been written 10 minutes earlier or half an hour earlier and was now part of the closing light show, because the idea was that we've now created this new collaborative audience created blueprint, and now we're showing the final shared blueprint. And also on the app at the same time, it was switching from your wayfinding and your clues and stuff to actually showing other random selections from the blueprints. So all of these people are starting to see all the other contributions happening, and possibly their own contributions, and seeing this new way of understanding the world. It became part of the light show. And then finally, after all of that, there was a final set of messages that came out as a final set of messages over this sort of cloudscape. And I, in fact, had set up an elaborately timed sequence of screens on the app to accompany this. But everyone was so busy watching the choirs and this new light show and the dancers and everything that hardly anybody ever noticed any of this, even though we'd spent huge amounts of time synchronizing everything to the second with the video projector people and the choir people and everything else. But that's okay. It was still a pretty amazing thing, because every night or at the end of every show, it felt like this magical homecoming, looking to the past and to the future with this whole community of interesting people who've all just been through this amazing experience in every single night. And I got to be there with the audience, hearing the applause for the show. And this is something rare for me as a software guy. This is something I'd forgot about from having not done actual theater in a while. Software is kind of like plumbing. If it's working properly, people don't really notice it. The best software often feels completely invisible. And I can't tell you how many times I've pushed super hard, worked late, pulled multiple rabbits out of multiple hats to get things done and delivered and working properly and on time, only to get the email response, "Okay, thanks." Or even worse, "This doesn't work in Internet Explorer 5. Fail. What kind of stupid things are you doing here?" Right? That's almost all you get. Submit stuff to the App Store. All you're ever going to get in reviews is people complaining about some feature that they decided that the app must have and is a total failure otherwise. Live shows, on the other hand, get applause. Actors get applause. Word got out that the guy in the bluish gray jacket, that was the guy who built all the apps and everything. So I had people coming up to me all the time congratulating me on what I had built. I got a big round of applause at the closing party as well, with high fives from the whole team. It was amazing. Once again, totally different from writing software for businesses, where all they do is send you a "okay, thanks" message, or the dreaded "please advise" message, which I frequently got as well. But I also want to talk about what it was like to work with Zupa Theater. And I think there's this impression that creatives and arts people and performance people and theater people are all sort of overly dramatic, melodramatic drama people, and they are artistes, and they're all about feelings, and everything's kind of chaotic and messy. But the kind of planning and collaborative skills you need to pull something like this together, I mean, frankly, any theater production for the most part, but especially something like this with hundreds and hundreds of moving parts in multiple locations, all sorts of different kinds of technical and creative aspects all fitting together, putting them together on schedule and on budget without having everybody melting down everywhere, these kinds of skills are breathtaking. And over my career, I've worked in startups, banks, tech, retail, government departments, all sorts of places. And frankly, nobody I've ever worked with was as well organized and productive, while still staying calm and positive on top of complete madness, as the top team at Zupa. And they did amazing, amazing work, and it was a real honor and pleasure to work with them. It was a great group to work with. All of us, everyone working on this, were top experts in our particular areas: dancers, actors, musicians, writers, lighting technicians, and me, the programmer. And we're all able to contribute creatively and respect each other's abilities, and that there wasn't a lot of weird gaslighting or anything like that. We were all the experts in our particular areas, and we let ourselves work with the strengths we had and collaborating with other people. So it was a really amazing thing to work on. What was perhaps the most striking thing about this project compared to so many of the others was also that I've had in the business world, was that this thing was definitely starting on September 26th at 5:30 p.m. Whether if it's not ready, then we got problems, right? So hundreds of moving parts had to come together at that time, and there were no excuses. Stuff had to work. If there was something that didn't really work, it needed to be triaged out. This is live. There is no turning back. There's no asking everyone to, maybe we can all come back tomorrow and start all over again. This provided a super intense clarity to the development process, and frankly, almost no government department or startup I've ever worked with has ever really had to deal with that kind of absolutely September 26th at 5:30 p.m., right? And to be honest, with that focus, things mostly worked. And the other flip side of that is that after 5 performances, after we finally really had everything running smoothly like a well-oiled machine, it was over. And I've forgotten that theater is like that. You spend months and months, and in this case, possibly over a year, building something amazing and creative for 5 shows. And then you're done. And that's kind of weird. But it's not really over yet. When we built this, we specifically built this out as a platform, something that could be extended, customized, and possibly used by other creative and related groups. The server side is flexible and configurable for many different kinds of, any kind of project that's dealing with time and location. It's a client server, just sends out JSON, has registration stuff built in already and all of that kind of thing. And the client side has a number of now battle-tested components which you can combine into new different kinds of apps. So we've set up a separate company to sell this and license this and work on this with other people. It's called Now Here, since of course it's about place and time, and it's also upon a nowhere, which of course nowhere, the word has the words now here inside of it. Something we only discovered halfway through the project when one of the writers pointed that out, and we started really running with that as a thing. But not only can this, of course, be used to do similar kinds of projects to this, just in other locations or at other times, but it could easily be adapted to something like Nocturne or Nuit Blanche or orientation for incoming students or a way to explore historical sites, for example, battlefields or fortresses or old cities or old towns and things like that. So there's lots of different ways that this could be used possibly for arts and culture and other kinds of activities. The next big use of the Nowhere framework will be this coming June 16th, 2019, for Bloomsday, celebrating James Joyce's Ulysses with different Halifax locations standing in for parts of Dublin. I had done a basic version of a Bloomsday app last year as an early test run for some of the technologies involved in this, but I had to cut things tight because we're under a deadline, obviously. But this year it'll be much more full-featured with much more interesting server-side storytelling components and a bunch of augmented reality scavenger hunt items for things that show up in the book, like bars of soap and such. So This Is Nowhere app, which was basically just a tour guide for the show, was going to be updated fairly shortly as a bit more of a memento for the experience, featuring pictures from each of the sites and all of the audience-created blueprint. And we're going to get that on the Google Play and iOS App Store fairly soon. And we're also thinking of maybe doing this whole thing again at some point, but I know a lot of people sort of figured this was now going to be an annual event. It's not, but I do know it is sort of part of Super's repertoire, and they're hoping to make it a thing they're going to be able to do again at some point. Since we've gotten all this stuff in place, now we know how it works. All we have to do is wrestle hundreds of creatives together and release lots of locations downtown and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, we're not sure when. So thank you. The performance is now over. And please let me know in the comments what you think. And you can contact me on Twitter and Facebook and things like that, an email, and let me know what you think. Thanks very much.